section is, I think, reading the paper is an interesting section. The focus is quite broad. We touch, like in other academic session, different topics. The title of our section is Code and the Law, so a very broad topic and also a classical topic if you want, code and law. But it's interesting because the people that present today the result of their research, from my perspective, introduce a fresh air in the discussion because they are quite young and they focus also on a different perspective. So they try to have a very practical approach, if you want, very empirical approaches. In the Liebert and La Diega paper, they focus on the ground studies, and they also touch new aspects like gay communities. That is a very specific topic that remember other kind of studies in the sociological area. And I think that is an interesting perspective because this idea, we have in the other panel a lot of presentation on the bigger problem. So GDPR in Europe and US, okay? But then we need also some more specific, and we need empirical studies in the field of data protection because a lot of studies in the field of data protection are not empirical studies, are mere theoretical studies. All the kind of studies are important, but empirical studies are useful in order to check if what we are trying to put in the law or also in our theoretical architecture works or it doesn't work. So I appreciate the two papers because although they offer different kind of perspective on different kind of topic, I think that the core element is the focus on the manner in which the principle of data protection are addressed in practice and in different contexts. So from this perspective, we start with Timothy Liebert, University of Oxford. His paper is on the impossibility of accepting the unknown, a web-scale analysis of the failure of notice and consent. So focus on notice and consent, but with a very empirical analysis based on the analysis of the website and their policies. So concrete result of what happens in practice, what is the law in force in the website. So the floor is yours. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you for the introduction. So the title of my talk is somewhat vague, but betrays the fact that it's going to be a bunch of numbers very soon. So the name of the talk is On the Impossibility of Accepting the Unknown, Web-Scale Analysis of the Failure of Notice and Choice. Quick outline of what I'm going to be talking about. Introduce myself really quick. Very quick background about web tracking and also regulation related to web tracking. Outline the research questions. Then I'm going to get into two measurement tools. One, web X-rays for measuring privacy loss on websites, and the second one is a brand new tool, Policy X-ray, that does very large-scale automated analysis of privacy policies. And then present my findings, which is a census of 1 million websites and automated analysis of 207,000 website privacy policies. It's about me. Tim Liebert, I just started a postdoc at the Reuters Institute at Oxford. My research always focuses on privacy security with a very deep focus on policy that comes from that. So I don't go super far into the CS side. I keep myself kind of grounded in the sociological and the policy world. Background of what I'm going to talk about. So first, web tracking. So people probably already know a lot of this, but basically a web page is not a unitary object when you download it. Web page, when you get it, it's an HTML file, which is more like a recipe. So the recipe tells your browser to get the ingredients for the page. Those ingredients are like images, JavaScript files, these little things that gets transferred to your computer. And each one of these kind of ingredients gets to your computer through a different network request using the hypertext transfer protocol. Now, there's two types of these network requests. The first is a first-party request. That generally means if you're looking at example.com in your browser bar and there's a picture on the page, it comes from example.com. That's a first party. You know you're looking at the page. Example.com knows you're looking at the page, and that's the universe of people who know what's going on. There's also third-party requests. So a third-party request is one of these ingredients, these page elements, be it a picture, a video, something else, comes from a domain other than that you see in your address bar. So this happens in, excuse me, This happens in the background, so you don't have to keep clicking every single thing that downloads, which is good. It's what a web browser does for you. The problem with that is that this information gets transferred in the background. What gets transferred is the address of the page you're looking at. So parties who you don't know get to make a record of all your browsing behaviors. So if your browsing behaviors are sensitive, they're related to sexual, political, etc., those things are going to get sent to people in the background just because there's an image on the page or a JavaScript file. So how does this get regulated? I'm going to do a very high-level overview that's going to be very rough. It's a very brief history of data protection. A lot of the contemporary privacy issues we see, even though people are very concerned about them, this isn't new stuff that nobody didn't foresee coming. So a very well-studied report in 1973, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare issued the Fair Information Practice Principles. I'm not going to go over them too deeply. Most people have some familiarity with them. But those have been very fundamental in the kind of spread of data protection around the world. So Helen Nissenbaum's called them a Bill of Rights. So from 1973, those got adopted in the OECD guidelines, which expanded to 8 principles, then the APEC guidelines, which was 9 principles, 1995 EU Privacy Directive, also loosely based on the concept of FIPS. So the question is, how do these principles, which have had wide adoption over about 40 years, how do these principles, which a lot of people value, apply to the web? And the answer is that the self-regulatory approach to privacy on the web takes 2 FIPS-like protections. So it reduces kind of like this broad range of FIPS to 2. So one is notice, excuse me, of data collection, and the other is choice. So depending on what legal jurisdiction you're in the United States, choice as offered by a self-regulatory regime is choice to see targeted advertisements or non-targeted advertisements. There's no choice in data collection. There's not a single online advertiser I know of in the US who, when you click an opt-out, it means they don't store data. It just means they don't show you stuff related to your browsing. So again, really glossing over things. In the US, the notice and choice model is usually kind of presented as an opt-out. The data processing happens until you say not to. The GDPR is trying to move into a more opt-in world. But regardless of opt-in or opt-out, neither of these totally meets the normative goals of FIPS, and Rotenberg has called notice and choice a creation of the US marketing industry, which I think is fairly accurate. So, setting out his background, there's web tracking, there's policies about web tracking. The general question is, are these policies working? And if they're not working, how are they not working in a really specific empirical way? So I took a few scoping decisions. First of all, I am treating privacy policies as the medium for notification. So instead of modal dialogues or we're going to set cookies, etc., which are usually very vague, I'm doing something very specific, which is privacy policies. I treat notification as revealing specific entities. So if a policy says we share data with third parties, it doesn't say who those parties are. By my standards for this study, that does not count as a disclosure. Third, I'm treating do not track as the only universal choice mechanism that exists on all browsers. So these are non-controversial criteria. If you want to ask me about why I made these decisions in QA, I'm happy to talk more. There's also some secondary considerations I made. First of all, third parties are not uniform. People working in this space know different major companies have very different policies about how they treat data. So one thing I wanted to really make sure I looked at in this study was who are these parties and what are their policies? How does this vary? And second, kind of a sub-FIPS guideline that usually pops up is data security. So for the context of the web, I looked at the use of transport encryption. So here are my questions about notice. Excuse me. Who are the third parties that collect data, and do they have consumer services users may already be aware of and have consented to? 2, if the users read a privacy policy, will they learn of who the parties that collect their data are on that site? How time-consuming and difficult is it to read website privacy policies, and how time-consuming and difficult is it to understand third-party policies? 2 questions related to choice. Do website policies mentioned in respect do not track? Do third-party policies do the same? Finally, security questions. What percentage of websites force encryption, and what percentage of third-party requests are encrypted? So I developed on my own 2 tools to conduct these measurement tasks, and they both function at a very large scale. I'm going to go over these kind of quick. If you have detailed questions about the methods, again, QA questions, hold on to this. So the first kind of 2 tasks to figure this out. 1, you have to figure out who the companies are who are tracking to start out with, and then 2, you have to locate, extract, and analyze the policies. So both of these are fairly difficult technical tasks. So the first, Web X-ray. This is a software platform I wrote, and the goal of it is to kind of reveal the social relationships that happen when you load a website. Because it's not just about tracking, it's about a company, an individual, and other entities having a new relationship as data gets transferred. So my focus is less on the how of tracking, which is more of a CS question, more of the who of tracking, which is a policy and social science question. So what Web X-ray does is loads the page, detects the third parties, and it attributes the data flows to the companies and other entities that receive them. Just real quick, so what we do is we look at a page, we see we have tracker.com is on the page. That's usually pretty difficult if it's registered anonymously to figure out who it is. So over the past 6 years, I and some people I've worked with have done a ton of digging, and I've identified 336 owners of 940 different domains, which has been incredibly time consuming because a lot of these tracking domains are designed not to be found. Again, this functions well at scale, and this has been used in a few studies I've published. People who've used OpenWPM at Princeton have used the attribution library specifically. So the newer one is Policy X-ray. So what we already have, if we've run Web X-rays, we know here's a set of sites, here's a set of companies on each single page who's collecting user data. So 3 steps for Policy X-ray. First, find the policy URL, extract it, and analyze it. So to find the URL, the current version that I use for this study only does English. I actually have a development branch that's added 7 languages to it. But basically what it does, looks at the website, it looks at the links starting from the foot of the page going to the top of the page, because footers are usually where privacy policy is. It tries to see, does it find a link that says privacy policy, terms of service, terms of use. If it does find that, what it will do is then it goes and loads that policy page with a web browser. The problem that you have to watch out for is I'm going to look at this policy text to see if a company is mentioned. But what about a case like this? So this is the Washington Post privacy policy. You'll notice all these things are not policy text, right? So if I just look at this page to find a mention of Facebook, there's a couple things that can go drastically wrong. First of all, what if there's a story about Facebook on the Washington Post today? Then all of a sudden I'm going to see Facebook on the policy page and I'll think they've been disclosed when they haven't. Other thing can happen, a lot of pages have these social media buttons on the side, and if you look at the code of the page, it will extract the names of every social media company. So the first couple times when I was prototyping this, I noticed, wow, like Twitter is mentioned like 90% of the time. They're not. So the problem is we have to kind of extract these. So what I figured out how to do is there's, if you ever use Firefox or Safari, they have this reader view where you can click a button and it kind of like declutters the page and just shows you the text. So what I actually do is I take that library, I inject it into the page at load, and then I extract the policy using that, and it works really well. So this is what you get when you apply readability.js to this page, which is good. And this also functions at scale. And then once I have the text, search for mentions of the companies, evaluate DNT, and evaluate text features. And again, I am still developing this. I've added 7 new languages now. If you have ideas for languages to add, please let me know, because it's pretty trivial for me to put new words in. So findings, tracking census. So this is just updating data I've done and other people have done. I looked at the Alexa 1 million. I was able to load 938,000 pages. I analyzed 88 million HTTP requests and 10 million cookies. Then I ran Policy X-ray over this set of data, and I was able to get 207,000 websites' privacy policies. The number of policies of unique policies is like 183,000 because a lot of websites will share a policy. So if there's a publishing group and we have 10 sites that have one policy. And then from those 207,000 sites, I looked at specific 1.8 million different data flows that I had identified to see if those were in those 207,000 policies. So macro level findings, 90% of pages have a third-party request. That's not news. 70% have a cookie, 86% have JavaScript. And one thing is actually pretty interesting. So this is the Alexa top 1 million. So at the very left are the highest ranked sites, and all the way to the right are the lowest ranked sites. And you'll notice the more popular a site is, especially those in the very top 10,000 have closer to 20 requests per page. And these are unique entities on each page. And it goes down more to 10. So there is a direct relationship between how popular your site is and how much tracking there is on that site. So getting back to the actual research questions. Number 1. Who are the third parties? So here are the top 10 companies you know of. It's always kind of interesting to me to point out just how dominant Google is on the web. We're looking at 1 million pages. Google's on 82% of 1 million pages. And so if you don't use Gmail, you don't use Google Maps, you don't use Google Search, you don't do Google anything, Google will get your browsing history no matter what. They're inescapable, and that's kind of scary to me personally. Same thing with Facebook. If you don't touch Facebook your entire life, but you don't use an ad blocker, on a third of sites they'll know who you are. But you also notice this number drops pretty quickly, and there's a very long tail that goes along with this. And I should also point out this is the top 10 for the study. I actually looked very closely at the top 25, but 25 fit on a PowerPoint slide much more poorly than 10. I'd also like to point out these companies are all American, which again, when we're discussing policy in Brussels, it's always important to point out that one of the difficulties of regulating online privacy is that you're regulating American companies who exist in a complete, basically regulatory vacuum where they can do whatever they like. And if you're coming from Europe, you're trying to make them behave in a way that frankly they don't have to at home. So do these companies have consumer services? So you could say from a notice and choice perspective, you already signed up for Google, you've made your Gmail, they said here's your notices, etc. You click through. Twitter, sign up your Twitter account, you click through, you know something, you've maybe consented to this, right? But of the top 25 companies, only 6 have consumer services. So for the vast majority of cases and the vast majority of these companies, there's no reason anybody would ever read their privacy policies because they're very niche ad tech firms. And the other thing about this too, it's important to mention, there's 6 that do have consumer services, but not everybody has a Twitter account, right? Not everybody has a Yahoo account. So when you actually remove those, you're talking about a very small number of tracking instances where somebody may have previously consented. So there's very little chance of pre-existing notice. So let's move forward from pre-existing notice. Let's say a user is very motivated and reads the privacy policy for the site she or he is visiting because they care about privacy and data protection and they just want to know what's going on. It's kind of a pointless task. People who read privacy policies will only find 14.8% of data transfers to known parties disclosed in the policy. With those companies that have consumer services, that's actually a little higher, 14.88. But here's the real kicker. For the companies that don't have consumer services, who you don't know about to start out with, that's less than 1% are they ever mentioned in any privacy policy. So 200,000 sites privacy policies. If you don't know about a company, you won't find out about the company. So if you have to ask, you'll never know. These companies are impossible to know about using the standard tools of notice and choice, which are supposed to be regulating this industry. There's also wide variation. So again, this we share with third parties isn't sufficient because third parties do different things. And as you can see here, Google's actually disclosed quite often, Facebook less, etc. But this is just one of many slides that you're going to see a lot of variation between these parties, which is why it's important to identify them. Next, how time-consuming and difficult is it to understand website privacy policies? You can guess. So there's a thing called the Flesch reading ease scale. This is a way to analyze English language text. It's a 100-point scale. Lower means it's easier to read. So the average for website privacy policies is about 40. So in the US state of Florida, for an insurance policy to be legally binding, it has to be written at 45. So these are not valid as insurance. The time to read these, the average length of the policies is 1,404 words, which is a little over 5 minutes to read. And this is actually pretty interesting. It varies tremendously. Blue is how long a policy is, and green is how difficult it is to read. Okay. So what you'll see here is, again, on the left are higher ranked websites, on the right are lower. So I think it's kind of funny. All websites are about the same level of difficulty of reading, meaning they're impossible to understand. But a popular website, you'll spend twice as much time not understanding something as a less popular website. So you can't read any of them, but you'll spend more time not understanding. Same question, but for the third-party privacy policies. So again, I looked at these 25 companies. Average score was slightly lower than websites. Again, for most of them, this is not a binding contract in the state of Florida. And again, there's variation. Facebook's actually would be valid in Florida. It's the easiest to read by far. A company called Pubmatic, their score was equal to what's estimated for an article in the Harvard Law Review, so not for the faint of heart. And the one thing I did just kind of for fun is, oh, here we go. This is 15 and a half minutes on average, so these are much longer than website policies. But here's the really fun thing. So I actually tried to figure out, on average, so if I take a page, figure out how long its privacy policy is, figure out all the third parties, how long are their privacy policies, and add all of them together, because if you visit a page, you have all these privacy policies you're subject to, right? If you add them all together, it actually would take you 84.7 minutes to read the privacy policies for all the data collectors that you're exposed to at once. And the point of this is not that anybody's doing this. The point is, if we're going to continue to pretend notice and choice is a viable framework, we're going to have to basically give everybody several weeks off a year to read privacy policies, which is not going to happen. So, do not track. Do not track is, as you know, a browser setting that is a polite request. It says, please do not track me. It is up to the data collector to choose whether or not they honor the request. And this is something that's expressed through policy rather than through technical measurement per se. Of website privacy policies, 7% contain a match on the words do not track. That in 15% of those cases, the words do not track are not in reference to the actual do not track standard. In 65% roughly, it is mentioned to say it's ignored. And then about 20% it's mentioned to say it's honored. So far more often is DNT specifically ignored than followed. Examples of language, we will not disable tracking in response to do not track. And this is Arkansas is a US state, and they actually say, well, the United States Federal Trade Commission has endorsed DNT. We don't. And this is another government site, so you have, it's crazy. And this is kind of a standard we do honor. These are, you know, the unicorns of the policy world. So again, third parties. How do third parties treat do not track? None of them offer unqualified support of the top 25. And there's no excuse for them not to mention, by the way. They all have data protection lawyers on staff. These are huge companies. They know what DNT is. Only 9 mention it. 7, again, mention it to say we don't follow it. And then 2 offer kind of like esoteric limited support. Latame says they support it for anyone other than Internet Explorer, which there's a reason for that, but still a bit vague. Encryption, am I on time? Got like 0? Okay. Encryption real quick. Websites, about 35% use encryption, but that varies dramatically. More popular websites are more likely to use encryption, which seems good, but don't forget, websites are also more, higher websites are also like to have more tracking. So do not confuse security with privacy. They're not always the same, and so while it's good to see more encryption, that doesn't mean privacy is better off. Third-party requests, variations in practice, again, so you see some companies go up and down. I'm out of time, so summary, I just want to say web tracking is ubiquitous and it's nearly impossible for users to figure out who's tracking them. This assumes a user can read every policy on the web, they just won't know. And also the who of tracking matters. This we share with third parties is not sufficient because the parties are different. So in my view, as a regulatory framework, notice and choice to start out with fails to meet normative goals in theory, and then when you actually dig into it, it fails to provide notice or choice in practice. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Is there any question? I have a question. Ah, there is no. Please, please. Okay, if you have any interaction with the company about the result, I have to repeat for the recording.
Yeah,
that one.
So for this, it actually took a lot of time, so I don't have time to talk to the companies, as you can guess. I've previously worked with Rebecca McKinnon on the Ranking Digital Rights project, where we were reading policies to give companies grades, basically according to what their policies included. So for that, I did a lot of manual reading of privacy policies, and we also talked to a lot of companies when we were developing the criteria for that project. So I have had conversations, kind of background over the years with people who worked at these companies, which also tuned me into the fact that, there's cultural differences within companies, and not like national cultures. Between American companies, people at Twitter feel a very different way than people at Facebook or Google, so there's a lot of variation there. These findings haven't been fully published yet, so maybe people have questions, but I mean, Google can search the whole web. Google can tell you every site that has Google Analytics. They know if Google Analytics is in the website privacy policy or not because they make a search engine. So this isn't news to them. If they don't know, it's willful.
Okay. Other questions? So we have not a lot of time, unfortunately, so ask the question, and all the questions, then probably if there is overlapping, we give you a final answer. Please.
To have a very quick answer for that, in the United States, the FTC does not have a privacy protection remit. They do deceptive trade practices. So as an American company, you can do the worst privacy things possible as long as your website says we do the worst things possible. If your website says we do not do bad things and you do, you will get fined. So the penalty for lying about respecting DNT versus not saying anything and doing horrible stuff is way worse. So if you put it on there and don't do it, you're really asking for trouble, so there's no benefit. They've levied fines. I mean, if you're a company and you're counsel for a major company, you are not going to put DNT in there unless you're really following it because it's a risk that you didn't have otherwise. It's creating risk where none existed. Yeah. Sort of.
Other question, please, there?
I mean, one thing I've been looking at GDPR a lot, and GDPR is still premised a lot on the idea of consent. And if you looked at some of those slides, the number of things you have to consent to is unimaginably large, So in terms of just the feasibility of consent, I just don't think it works from a technical level unless we completely rewrite how web content is delivered, which I don't think is going to happen. Me personally, over time, I've evolved from thinking choice was a good idea to why are we requiring people to do someone else's job? Like if I go to the supermarket, I don't have to know what ingredients mean on the label. I know they're not poisonous and they won't kill me. I feel the job of academics and policymakers is to make sure people don't have to make these choices by setting rules that are clearly defined and followed. I don't really think, people have busy lives. Why should they be clicking consent things all day? It's not fair to people. It's kind of dumb. So Yes.
short question.
So in regards to the first question, so I guess you could say it's a scraper, right? It goes to the thing, and then like it gets the policy out. It stores it in a database, and then it does processing later. No, that's automatic. So it's a, excuse me. I use this readability JS library to extract it, which is the Mozilla code. In regards to the second question, do people try to stop scraping? Yes, and you have to be a little smarter than the people trying to stop you from doing it. But yeah, I mean, I haven't had that much problem. I do use browsers to execute stuff, so I've been using Chrome a lot more lately because it has better like automation support than it used to, but it's still pretty resource heavy. But if you want to know even more about the intricacies of pretending not to be a computer program when you're accessing web pages, I'm happy to talk about it. Good. Okay.
No, I have a short question.
Yes.
In your research, you use very English-based and US-based metrics. So only English in English text written in English, and also in the stage you use the index for based on US K-12 scale and so on.
Yep.
This may affect mainly when we talk about European level the results in terms of ability of an European user to understand this, because in many cases they don't read the original English text but the translated version, and probably also the result of US K-12 scale can be not the same compared to the Europe.
So so this study was my dissertation, was written in the U.S. about tracking in the U.S. from a U.S. perspective. I'm living in Europe now, at least for the next 15 minutes, according to the U.K. government. But I am currently living in the European Union. So what I'm actually doing right now is, as I mentioned, I'm looking at 7 different countries. So what that is required is figuring out the terms that are associated with privacy policy. So like, it's not just a Google Translate problem, like, you know, the German word is different. It's not even a word that exists in English. Likewise, I have a few different languages. The applicability of the reading metric formula is not universal. So I have been trying to dig around and see if there's other things. The nice thing about the fact that the word Google is Google in German and Italian and French, the word Twitter is Twitter in German, Italian, and French. So searching for the companies is actually not a problem. So I have been extracting more text, and just the overall hits I'm getting is getting large. So I'm doing a 7-nation study now, and rolling into the GDPR. I'm trying to get as many policies as I can. But again, if you know a language, tell me.
Thank you for this presentation, and unfortunately we have not enough time to continue this discussion. The second presentation by Ivo Emanuilov, sorry for the pronunciation, from the K Leuven. The focus is on navigating law and software engineering towards privacy by design, stepping stone for bridging the gap. Let's try to put together the two cultures, the legal culture and the technical culture. In my experience as a professor at Polytechnical University, it's not so easy. Sometimes it's probably impossible, but we may to have some suggestions from the presentation.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. I'm very pleased to see a full room here, and I must say I'm honored to have the opportunity to present the result of the result of this research that we've been conducting with a team, interdisciplinary team of researchers at the University of Leuven. It should be fine. Apologies, we are experiencing some technical difficulties.
If you want, you can also start with that presentation. I think that they follow you.
Well, that's sure, but I just wanted to show a few things. We have some visuals, and that's why I insist on.
Wait.
Yeah.
I can go first.
Shall we use the other one? This slide here, actually.
It should work.
Maybe we can start with the following presentation. You put on a pen drive the document and we share with the. We have a pen drive.
We're good to go now. Apologies. So this is a truly interdisciplinary work of a team of researchers at the University of Leuven, the Center for IP and IT Law, which I am representing, and the Department of Computing Science, Distrinet. So it's really an initiative that we've just embarked on. So it's not really the results of the work that we have, but rather what we are planning to do from now on. So this is an outline, a map of the steps that we would like to take to tackle the issues of bridging together law and software engineering. It's playing tricks on me. Good. So we've got some characters here. That's Catherine, she's a developer, and George, who is a lawyer. They are very good friends. They occasionally go out for a drink, and they talk a lot at work because they have to. But they don't like looking at each other's computers because that's Catherine's computers on the left, and that's George's computer on the right. Why is this such a big problem, however? Why do we see the communication, the dialogue between the two disciplines being so hard? Actually, the work of a computer scientist and the work of a lawyer are very similar because just like we solve problems, so do programmers. And they like the certainty, the predictability of the code they write as much as we like the certainty and predictability in the cases we have to solve, or at least supposedly. There is not just misalignment, it is very important to stress on this, not just misalignment between the way lawyers and engineers speak, but also misalignment between the business processes, the business modeling of a system, and the way these processes are communicated between the various stakeholders. So it is not just an interrelation of code and law. There are also other factors that need to be taken into account in this dialogue and other stakeholders that need to be involved. What's so hard about software engineering? We have implementation of the developer's interpretation of what a problem is. And this is very, very crucial. Why is that so? Because programming languages are rule-based, software systems are rule-based, they are computable, and they are fairly predictable. However, whenever a developer is communicating with a lawyer, they get instructions. The lawyer expects that these instructions, that these guidelines that are provided will be implemented in the way they've been given. But that's not what goes into the system. What goes into the system is the interpretation of the developer himself or herself. We say that computer scientists work with Turing-complete programming languages. And what does that mean? It means that they're dealing with problems that can be computed given enough time and storage. On the other hand, we've got the legal code. We're dealing with issues and concepts such as appropriate technical and organizational measures. We're dealing with effective manners and finding necessary safeguards. And these are terms quite vague. These are terms defined by lawyers, interpreted by lawyers, given meaning by lawyers. We have sheer amount of laws, we have sheer amount of different interpretations, and each of these interpretations are domain specific. They are cross-referenced, they are open-ended, and they are value-based. What does that mean? It means that the legal language is non-Turing complete. You cannot express the problem in computable terms. You need to include your evaluation, your interpretation of the problem you're dealing with. How did it all start? In 1999, this is the famous book of Lawrence Lessig that I assume most of you know. Whereas the primary idea of the title says it all. We see code and other laws of cyberspace. So what Lessig suggests is that we have code as a regulator, but code alone is not the only regulator, and that's something I suggested. We also have other regulators such as norms, the market, the architecture, and so on. In the domain of data protection and privacy, we had the concept of privacy by design evolving since the early 90s and even before that, up until the time we see it for the first time legislatively defined in the General Data Protection Regulation. But as I mentioned, the ideas, the concepts that lawyers work with and the ideas and concepts that developers work with are like two different universes. You have two different models that you have to work with. And why is there the need to bridge the gap? Because if we want to see these principles, these legal implications of the regulatory privacy framework, such as the General Data Protection Regulation, we need to initiate this dialogue. And up until now, we've had this at a meta level. So we've been talking about the need to have engineers and lawyers communicating with each other, but we have not seen any tangible efforts in that direction. Here is an example of 3 use cases where you can see the different approach of privacy engineers and lawyers. So for example, in the case of personal use of data by employees, for an engineer, the primary concern when it comes to data protection, the way data protection is interpreted by an engineer means, and it is related mostly to confidentiality. So they will be looking at minimization techniques, they will be looking at security-related protection of the data. Whereas for lawyers, we will also want to consider, in this particular example, for example, the employment context, we will need to consider the power asymmetry. So it's not enough to secure consent, because consent might not be a suitable lawful ground for processing in the first place. We will also need to protect against illegitimate use, and that's what the principle of accountability calls for. And the other examples of self-explanatory. The main tenet is that it is easier said than done to have complementary solutions that bridge together computer science and law. And that's why we need interdisciplinary research. That's why we've embarked on this journey, which admittedly won't be an easy one, because if it were so easy, we would already have this in place. So we have on the one hand privacy regulation, and on the other hand privacy engineering. And this large gap, that's not closing, it's actually extending, because the way we see regulation, the way we have formulations, the legal definitions, and the language as a whole expressed and used in contemporary legislation, including the GDPR, is contrary to that. In fact, we have a complex language of the GDPR. And it is an irony because the GDPR advocates the use of plain language that software engineers will are very unlikely to understand. So we have terminology on the one hand, and we have the compliance, the need to be compliant versus the external threats we have. So I mentioned already that as a privacy engineer would focus on the internal threats coming from an outside, internalized threats coming from an outside attacker. So that's a security approach. Whereas for us, lawyers, we will want to see what happens inside an organization because the main threats come from the controller and processors as the parties with ultimate access to personal data. And as I mentioned, what we propose are stepping stones. We do not claim to propose the solutions because we might come to these solutions, but it might be that closing the gap completely is impossible. And this will also be an answer. What is the first step we propose? We propose the establishment of a common conceptual framework of the terminology we use in the domains of privacy engineering and the domain of law. What does that mean? It means that we need to bootstrap this interdisciplinary dialogue. We've had the chaotic use of terms and very often in the software engineering community, quite naive interpretation of what the law means or what the law entails. It does not mean that we will achieve a full agreement on the meaning of the terms. But take privacy, for example. The very concept of privacy is problematic, and it means completely different things to the two communities. At the preliminary stage, we've identified that we have two tools in the toolkit of lawyers that might come to help. In the first place, that's the systematic interpretation. To a lawyer, that's one of the very first things we learn. And systematic interpretation actually helps us find a place and interactions of a rule and concept. It helps us find whether it's been applied consistently, and it also helps us find the impact of any changes that are introduced to this rule. So if we create a system of these concepts, notions, and rules, we can have a very full overview of what is going on. And depending on the changes that occur, we can keep this up to date. And the second step would be the use of teleological interpretation, another important tool of a lawyer's toolkit. So that helps us find the purpose of the rule and helps us substantiate the results of this systematic interpretation. In the end, using knowledge representation, we would be aiming for the creation of a taxonomy, of a typology of the terms, and thus contributing to the development of a common conceptual framework for the two disciplines. The second step, defining tool support for data protection impact assessment. We all know that data protection impact assessment is a risk assessment tool, but it should start at the design stage. Despite the fact that the regulation prescribes that the design stage is actually the moment that a controller assumes status, and despite the recital in which producers of software and services are only encouraged to take into account privacy by design measures at the design stage, we all know that market-driven incentives will force producers of software to comply with these requirements. Question is, how do we do that? It's not so easy. Currently, we have a complete lack of tool support. And that tool support, whatever it might be, has to be naturally integrated into the developer's framework. What does that mean? It could be a plugin for an integrated development environment. It could be a contextual advisory. It could be anything you can think of, but it has to come natural. It has to be like the new GitHub for developers. And how do we do that? We need to build a sound methodology that at least partially automates this process, but also a methodology that integrates not only the legal, but not only the technical, but also the legal knowledge of privacy that we have. And that's something that currently does not does not exist to the best of our knowledge. The third step is related to the provision of decision and trade-off support to technical and organizational mitigation strategies. And this has to be integrated into the software development lifecycle itself. So this is a step that involves something that is very typical of the software engineering community, and that is the trade-off they have to make in designing a solution. What does this entail? It's not always really straightforward to identify a solution to a problem, because you might have to consider factors such as the performance of a solution, whether it is cost efficient, and how it affects other software qualities. It is not just enough to place a solution, because it affects other parts of the system. And you need to evaluate, you need to have a clear understanding of how this impacts other components of a system. In this process, we will be aiming for the collecting of privacy engineering knowledge. If in catalogs of privacy knowledge we already have this, and a typical example is the Linden methodology, which provides a very good catalog of such privacy knowledge. But even Linden itself needs to account for the legal concepts, and that's something we will be aiming to do, to extend, to build upon what's already out there. And the fourth step, it's assuring legal accountability. We all know that this is a cornerstone of the novel approach taken by the General Data Protection Regulation, and we also need to do this throughout the software development lifecycle. What that entails, we need to do this at a process level. It's not just sufficient to take this at an organizational level. And we need to ensure traceability of the decisions that have been encoded, that have been taken by the developer in the process of development. Such tool support for automated verification of privacy properties, as we call them in computer science, rarely exist. And even if we have, they're in the very beginning and are not complete, and do not account for the legal aspect. We need to keep versioning systems, because it is not enough that you document the architecture once. It evolves. We have agile software development techniques. We have continuous adaptations and changes in the process of development and execution of a system. It evolves, and we need governance systems that help monitor compliance, not just at the design stage. We also need to monitor compliance continuously, whereas while a product is updated, while new versions are issued, and this has to happen in real time, and the relevant issues have to be notified to the appropriate stakeholder, for example, a data protection officer of a data controller. And then finally, we need to make sure that this is tamper-proof. Because if anyone can go and change the documentation, if anyone can tamper with it, then it's no point. Then we are not complying with this principle of accountability. How can we do that? We need integration with either trusted time-stamping authority or relying on novel methods such as distributed ledgers based on consensus. And we need to do that because this is where we currently are. We need to fix that crack. Whether we can do it, we don't know. But it promises a nice future if we at least embark on this initiative. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your presentation. Personally, I'm not so pessimistic working with computer scientists about this gap. I suggested to have a final round of questions in order to give chance to the last speaker to have a comfortable presentation. So please remember the questions that are arising from this presentation, and we'll make at the end. Please. The last presentation by Noto La Diega.
Yeah, so it's quite late, so I think it's important to start talking about sex, which is a good way not to fall asleep, hopefully. Let's see if I can make this work. I hope I am. Yeah, okay, so great. I would like to ask you, raise your hand, who here has never used a dating app? Never used. You're all liars, and I can see that in your eyes. Anyway, but you are familiar with the concept, Tinder, let's say. What if I say Grindr? Anyone? No idea? Okay.
That's sensitive data.
Yeah. In fact, it's up to you to decide whether to disclose it or not. Yeah, it's a test. Also, this is part of my research. Okay, Grindr is the most famous and common dating app for men who have sex with men, gay men, like if we want to make it short, but it's not only gay men. So you never heard of it, but you know Lithuania, right? This is not sensitive data, you can say yes. Lithuania, yes. Okay, multiply Lithuania for 9 times. You have the number of users constantly using this Grindr app. And this is just one of the apps that men who have sex with men use, okay? And this app has just been bought by a tech giant in China for $250 million. So just keep this in mind, 27 million users, $250 million China, okay? Let's see, if it works. So I hope some of you will enjoy this. So what's my research question? Can these platforms be held liable for the illegal activities carried out by their users? So this is about intermediary liability, essentially, to give it a boring name. So which kind of illegal activities can you carry out using these apps? You can, for instance, use them to deal with drugs. That's very common. Pimping, harassment, hate speech, bullying, stalking, or fake profiles. These are just examples of a number of potentially or illegal things that people do using these apps. So when they do this, so if a fake profile is used to stalk me, under which circumstances can the platform be held liable? So what if I asked, what would you like if 700 beautiful women or men showed up at your door asking for sex? Some of us might enjoy that, but if you think about it, it's kind of distressing a little bit, 700, I mean, I understand 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, but 700 is a little bit too much. And why that happened? Because Matthew's ex-boyfriend was mad at him because they broke up, and therefore he created a number of fake profiles giving the address of this guy, saying, I really want to have violent sex, come and find me at this address, okay? Matthew asked Grindr to take down the fake profiles, and Grindr didn't do anything, okay? So there is currently a lawsuit in the United States. Another case that really attracted my attention is this one. There was this guy, he was 18, and the last thing he did before disappearing was being on Grindr. So the police was asking the platform to hand over the data in order to find the guy who was missing. The platform didn't hand over the data, and a couple of days later, Dakota, his name was Dakota, was found dead. And so the family is still asking justice, and they want to know why there was no cooperation on the side of the platform. And I think that the reason why there was no cooperation is the intermediary liability regime, because they knew that if they actually sort of confessed that they actually monitor the user's content and the user's behavior, they couldn't claim immunity from liability. So how does it work, this intermediary liability regime? Essentially, you might have heard of the safe harbors, right? So the point is that if you're not, you as a website, you're not producing the content yourself, but you're just sort of hosting it or similar activities, then you're not liable for the illegality of that content, let's say. So when are you liable if someone of your users do something illegal? If you have knowledge of that activity or that content. And when do you have knowledge? Usually when there is a notice. The notice and take down procedure, right? So if someone actually informs the platform that something illegal is going on, then the platform should act immediately to remove the content. Now, just let's stop for a second and let's think, why does this regime work like this? The rationale for it is that there is no general obligation to monitor users. So the point is that if there was a general obligation to monitor users, then you could hold the platforms liable. Since there is not such an obligation, then they can escape liability, let's say, if they have no knowledge of the illegal activities. The justification for this are privacy and freedom of expression. Why is that? Because they say, if we ask Facebook to actually monitor you, of course, they are breaching your privacy, and they could become the police of the internet, and therefore breaching your freedom of expression. And I call bullshit on this. Let's see why. So I would like to see, first of all, if these platforms actually protect the user's privacy. So I would contend that they don't do it, and in the first place, they have control over the user's content, of their user-generated content and their behavior, because every time you upload a picture, there is an ex-ante screening where a human operator is double-checking that your picture is not too hot before being that picture online. So there is a control over that content, and there is an ex-post control over the description of your profile. So if you say, yeah, I'm a very hot person, blah, 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 that sort of description of yourself is double-checked ex-post. So I was curious to know which data do these companies access, which data does Tinder access of you. And you find a number of examples of data that they access, but you don't know all the data that they access, only examples. I think the creepiest point is that they access and they collect and store all your messages. So you send all these messages about your private life, your sexual preferences, and so on, and they store everything. And why do they do that? Because someone was mentioning before, Ivo, also the principle of purpose, specification, and so on. The purpose of this storing is archival purposes, because they want to have an archive with all the pictures of penises in the world, or as otherwise allowed by law. What does it mean? Is it a purpose as otherwise allowed by law? I don't think this is a purpose. So they store all these data. Now, I was saying before that Grindr has been bought by a Chinese tech group. Okay, so at some point people started asking, but what is going to happen? I mean, China, like the Chinese government, are they going to access all my data, since now they are moving all my data to China? And I would like that you keep this in mind, because it's increasingly happening that Chinese companies are buying European and US companies, and therefore our data are being transferred to China. And I love China and Chinese people, but that's a legal point that I'm making. So Grindr replied saying, don't worry guys, the Chinese government will never have access to your data, which is fine. My question is, should we believe them or not? Let's see what I found in the privacy policies in terms of service and guidelines and all that crap. The first thing is that, of course, if a company buys Grindr, then that company owns the data. So the first step that we have to keep in mind is that the Chinese group now is the owner, is the data the owner, let's say the owner of that data. And as a consequence of that, Grindr informs you that you might be left without a legal remedy in the event of a privacy breach. They are very clear about it. But you may think, yes, but that's not going to happen because there is a privacy policy which is very protective of their users, and they will never give up our data to the government. Why should they do that? And so you find that Grindr may disclose your data in response to subpoenas, warrants, which is fine, but also or to comply with relevant laws. What does it mean? I will hand over your data to whatever just to comply with relevant laws. What are these relevant laws that apply to Chinese data? Let's see what are these laws in a second. The first one is the new security law passed this year that gives state intelligence the power to monitor domestic and foreign individuals and bodies in order to protect national security. So that's a first law with which Grindr will comply. Then another point is that there are tightening links between the Communist Party and tech groups such as the one that bought Grindr. And as a consequence, the main social media, the same main social networking sites in China, WeChat, is censoring politically sensitive messages already. And they are handing over the data to the police. So I wonder if WeChat, which is the most powerful social networking site in China, is already handing over all the data. Why shouldn't Grindr do the same? And last but not least, there is a little problem that, according to the, one of the Chinese regulators, homosexuality is abnormal, and therefore the gay content must be taken down. So how is this going to play with the compliance with the relevant laws of Grindr? And then I wonder if the standard of consent that you find in the relevant policies is actually compliant with the GDPR. So you consent, you expressly consent, they say, by accessing the service. So is like accessing the service actually express consent, or is it something else? And then you can decide to ask to revoke your consent, but probably we will say no, because the law might permit us to say no, or if we are unable to verify your identity. So you must choose between privacy and data protection. So if you want to revoke your consent to the processing of your personal data, you have to give up with your identity. We have to disclose your identity. And I think it's a very interesting trade-off that you have there. So I was wondering, how is privacy negotiated in these markets? So first of all, you have that Grindr, for instance, has, when I talk about legals, I mean terms of service, privacy policy, usage guidelines, and so on, because it's not just a privacy policy, it's, as we've seen before, a number of different contractual or quasi-contractual documents. Grindr has 14,000, nearly 15,000 words for his legals. It takes you 2 hours, 37 minutes, and 39 seconds to read them all. The readability is college level, so unless you have that education, you cannot understand them. Do you have an education? No. 59% of the users don't have enough, the sufficient required level of education to understand the privacy policies. Add to that, as you said before, also there are third parties, legal terms of service and privacy policy, and of course the platform will change at any time at their discretion their terms, and without any notice, and your continued use indicates that you agree with it. It's a very GDPR compliant consent. Just to make an example, just the terms of service of Grindr are as readable as Machiavelli's The Prince and as long as Sleepy Hollow. These terms and privacy policies are very opaque. I distributed a survey to 54 users of these apps. 70% said they don't read the terms, they don't understand them because they are too long, full of jargon, boring, irrelevant, complicated. They don't trust the platform. They say they might say something in the privacy policy and then, as you said before, do something completely different in practice. So what I was wondering is, yeah, that's fine. Maybe a solution could be a privacy by contract design. Okay? Do you know the data protection by design approach? Yeah. So I'm proposing to interpret that principle in a broad way, as encompassing also the design of the contract itself. So, because I believe that only a contract which is short and very clear, very readable, can actually comply with the GDPR and also with the Data Protection Directive, actually. So if there is now this mandatory requirement of data protection by design, this should encompass also the design of the contract itself. Okay, so the last point is, again, remember, privacy is the justification for the immunity from liability of these platforms. And then the other justification is freedom of expression, and I move to the conclusions. So do these apps respect the user's freedom of expression or not? It's interesting, again, reading the terms of service, because you will find that even if you don't do anything legal, if they believe that this is what you do is objectionable or inappropriate, you know, still they could take down your content and close your account. Freedom of expression. Or if you post a picture where there is no nudity, again, they could be the cause for the suspension of your account or the takedown of the content. Again, freedom of expression. You cannot use curse words. You cannot use the word party, for instance, party, because it implicates that you want to take drugs. And my favorite one is that you cannot do anything which is contrary to morality. Freedom of expression, okay? So to conclude, I believe that these platforms have knowledge of what the users do, of their illegal activities, because they actually monitor them. They say they don't do it. They say Grindr does not control the content of user accounts and profiles, but that's not true, because we know that there is an ex-ante screening of the pictures that are used. And then there are provisions like this that are unacceptable because they are not enforceable. They say, even if we know what's going on, even if we monitor you, nevertheless, we will not be liable for what you do. No, you can't have it both ways. If you monitor me, you will be held liable for what I do, okay? If you don't react, clearly. For instance, they disclaim all liabilities, including death. So if you die as a consequence of using too much these apps, they're not liable. Of course, this is not enforceable, again, under the Unfair Terms Directive. So the conclusions, just 3 points that I would like you to keep in mind. First, if you as a platform, Tinder, Facebook, whatever, decide to monitor me, you breach my privacy, you breach my freedom of expression, you cannot escape liability just to say, I don't know anything, and therefore I'm not liable. I think in that case, privacy and freedom of expression practically are a very weak foundation for the immunity from liability. Second, more generally, I think that I'm not entirely confident that in this context with data-fueled, mass asymmetric, privately ordered transactions, GDPR in itself is fit for purpose. And third, as I was saying before, my proposal is to interpret the data protection by design approach in an extensive way as to include also the design of the contract. That should be short and very clear and very easy to understand for everyone. Otherwise, I don't know what we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. So unfortunately, due to the fact that we start a bit late, there is not a lot of time for questions, but if you have some question, you can make the question right now or continue the discussion after the session, up to you. Is there any question? There.
I have a question to the first question.
Perfect.
So I'm not surprised that the gap between the developers and the lawyers is both widening, because I mean, the GDPR is introducing a risk-based approach, and risk-based approaches put the onus of the whole assessment on the company, so the ambiguity is growing. But what I'm wondering is, certainly as a proposing, how do you think would that play into developing a technical standards that could fill that gap? Because normally in risk regulation what you have is technical standards fill that gap that is actually arising out of that
So your question is how the proposed common conceptual framework will impact standards making?
Or do you think that your approach could be used in developing?
Certainly. That's one of the goals that we have with this conceptual framework, that we approach standardization organizations and that we try to suggest this as being included, because we know, yes, it is an industry that is more or less driven by standards. The more standards we have, and the more they account for the legal aspects, for the legal issues, the better. So yes, definitely.